Overall, I had plenty of reasons to be happy with living in Pennsylvania. However, there were two things I regretted: no way to defend ourselves and no proper education for young people. There was no local army and no college. So, in 1743, I wrote a plan to start an academy. At the time, I thought Reverend Mr. Peters, who was unemployed, would be a good person to run it. So I told him about my idea. But he had better job prospects working for the colony's owners, which worked out for him, so he turned down the offer. Since I didn't know anyone else suitable for the job then, I put the plan on hold for a while. I had more success the next year, 1744, when I proposed and started a philosophical society. The document I wrote for that will be in my collected papers. Regarding defense, Spain had been at war with Great Britain for several years, and then France joined them, putting us in serious danger. Our governor, Thomas, had been at war with Great Britain for several years, and then France joined them, putting us in serious danger. Our governor, Thomas, had tried hard and for a long time to convince our Quaker Assembly to pass a law for a local army and make other plans to protect the province, but it all failed. So I decided to see what could be done if people voluntarily formed a group. To get this going, I first wrote and published a pamphlet called Plain Truth. In it, I clearly showed how vulnerable we were and explained why we needed to unite and be organized for our defense. I also promised to propose a group in a few days that people could sign up for. The pamphlet had an immediate and surprising impact. People asked me for the official document to join the group. After I finalized the draft with a few friends, I arranged a meeting for citizens in the large building I mentioned earlier. The place was quite full. I had prepared many printed copies and made sure there were pens and ink spread throughout the room. I gave them a short speech about it, read the document, explained it, and then handed out the copies. People signed them enthusiastically, without a single objection. When everyone left and the papers were collected, we found over 1,200 signatures. With more copies distributed in the countryside, the total number of sign-ups eventually reached over 10,000. Everyone got their own weapons as soon as possible, formed companies and regiments, chose their own leaders, and met weekly to learn drills and other military training. The women, by collecting money among themselves, provided silk flags. They presented these to the companies, decorated with various designs and slogans that I provided. The officers of the companies that made up the Philadelphia Regiment met and chose me as their colonel, but I felt I wasn't suitable, so I turned down the position. Instead, I recommended Mr. Lawrence, who was a distinguished and influential man, and he was appointed. Then I suggested a lottery to cover the cost of building a defensive wall, a battery, below the town and equipping it with cannons. The lottery quickly sold out, and the battery was built quickly, with its protective sections made of logs filled with earth. We bought some old cannons from Boston, but they weren't enough, so we wrote to England for more, and at the same time asked the colony's owners for some help, though we didn't really expect to get it. Meanwhile, the association members sent Colonel Lawrence, William Allen, Abram Taylor, and me to New York to borrow some cannons from Governor Clinton. At first, he flat out refused us, but during dinner with his council, where they drank a lot of Madeira wine, as was the custom there at the time, he gradually became more agreeable and said he'd lend us 6. After a few more drinks, he increased it to 10. Eventually, he very kindly agreed to 18. They were excellent 18-pounder cannons, complete with their mounts. We quickly transported and installed them on our battery. There, the association members kept watch every night during the war, and among the rest, I regularly took my turn on guard duty like any other soldier. The governor and council approved of my involvement in these efforts. They trusted me and consulted me on every decision where their agreement was considered helpful to the association. Using religion to help, I suggest they declare a day of fasting to encourage moral improvement and ask for God's blessing on our efforts. They accepted the idea, but since it was the first time a fast had ever been considered in the province, the secretary had no previous example to follow for the official announcement. My New England upbringing, where a fast is announced every year, was helpful here. I drafted it in the usual style. It was translated into German, printed in both languages, and spread throughout the province. This gave religious leaders of various denominations a chance to encourage their congregations to join the association, and it likely would have been widely adopted by everyone except Quakers if peace hadn't come so soon. Some of my friends thought that my involvement in these matters would offend the Quakers, and as a result, I'd lose my influence in the provincial assembly, where they held a large majority. A young man who also had friends in the assembly and wanted to take over my clerk position informed me that they had decided to remove me at the next election, so, out of goodwill, he advised me to resign, saying it would be more honorable than being fired. I told him that I had read or heard about a public figure who made it a rule never to ask for a job and never to turn one down when offered. I said, I approve of his rule, and I'll follow it with a small addition. I will never ask for, never refuse, and never resign from an office. If they want to give my clerk position to someone else, they'll have to take it from me. I won't give it up and lose my chance to get back at my opponents later. However, I never heard anything more about it. I was re-elected unanimously, as usual, at the next election. Perhaps they disliked my recent close relationship with the council members, who had sided with the governors in all the arguments about military preparations that had bothered the assembly for so long. They might have been happy if I had left voluntarily, but they didn't want to remove me just because of my enthusiasm for the association, and they couldn't really come up with another excuse. In fact, I had reason to believe that none of them really opposed defending the country, as long as they weren't required to help. And I found that many more of them than I would have thought, while against starting wars, were clearly in favor of defending themselves. Many pamphlets were published on the topic, some even by respected Quakers, arguing for defense. I believe these convinced most of their younger members.
Something that happened in our fire company gave me some insight into their general feelings. It had been suggested that we support the plan to build a battery by spending our current funds, about £60 at the time, on lottery tickets. According to our rules, no money could be spent until the meeting after the proposal was made. The company had 30 members, 22 Quakers, and only 8 from other religious groups. The 8 of us attended the meeting on time, but even though we thought some Quakers might join us, we weren't at all sure we'd have a majority. Only one Quaker, Mr. James Morris, seemed to oppose the idea. He expressed great regret that it had even been suggested, saying that they were all against it, and it would cause so much disagreement that it might break up the company. We told him we saw no reason for that. We were the minority, and if they were against the measure and outvoted us, we would and should submit, as is customary in all organizations. When it was time to vote, someone moved to do so. He admitted we could do it by the rules then, but he assured us that several members intended to show up to oppose it, so it would be fair to wait a little for them to arrive. While we were arguing about this, a waiter came to tell me 2 gentlemen downstairs wanted to speak with me. I went down and found they were 2 of our Quaker members. They told me 8 of them were gathered at a nearby tavern. They were determined to come and vote with us if needed, though they hoped it wouldn't be necessary.
They asked us not to call for their help if we could manage without it, because voting for such a thing might cause trouble with their elders and friends. Since I was now sure of a majority, I went back upstairs and, after a slight show of hesitation, agreed to delay for another hour. Mr. Morris admitted this was extremely fair. None of his opposing friends showed up, which greatly surprised him. When the hour was up, we passed the resolution 8-1. Out of the 22 Quakers, 8 were ready to vote with us, and 13, by not showing up, showed they weren't inclined to oppose it. Afterward, I estimated that only 1 out of 21 Quakers was genuinely against defense. This is because they were all respected, regular members of the Quaker community and had been properly informed about the proposal at that meeting.
The respected and knowledgeable Mr. Logan, who had always been a Quaker, wrote a letter to them stating his approval of defensive war and backing his opinion with many strong arguments. He gave me £60 to spend on lottery tickets for the battery. He instructed me to use any winnings entirely for that purpose. He told me the following story about his old boss, William Penn, concerning defense. When he was a young man, he came over from England with the colony's owner, William Penn, as his secretary. It was wartime, and their ship was chased by an armed vessel, which they thought was an enemy. Their captain prepared for defense, but he told William Penn and his Quaker companions that he didn't expect their help and they could go below deck. They all did, except James Logan, who chose to stay on deck and was assigned to a cannon. The supposed enemy turned out to be a friendly ship, so there was no fighting. But when the secretary went below to share the news, William Penn severely scolded him for staying on deck and offering to help defend the ship, which went against the principles of Quakerism, especially since the captain hadn't even asked for his help. This public scolding annoyed the secretary, who replied,
Spending many years in the Assembly, where Quakers always held the majority, often showed me how awkward their anti-war principle made them feel whenever the Crown ordered them to provide funds for military needs. On one hand, they didn't want to offend the government by directly refusing. On the other hand, they didn't want to upset their fellow Quakers by going against their principles. This led to various excuses to avoid complying, and ways to hide their compliance when it couldn't be avoided. Eventually, the common practice was to approve money by calling it for the king's use, and never asking how it was actually spent. But if the request didn't come directly from the Crown, that phrase wasn't considered appropriate, so they had to come up with something else. For example, when gunpowder was needed, I think for the Louisburg garrison, and the New England government asked Pennsylvania for some, Governor Thomas strongly pushed the Assembly to grant it. They couldn't approve money specifically for gunpowder because that's a tool of war. Instead, they voted £3,000 in aid for New England to be given to the governor and designated it for buying bread, flour, wheat, or other grain. Some council members, wanting to make things even harder for the Assembly, advised the governor not to accept the provisions, arguing it wasn't what he had asked for. But he replied, "I'll take the money because I understand exactly what they mean. Other grain means gunpowder." So he bought gunpowder, and they never objected. It was because of this incident that, when our fire company worried our lottery proposal wouldn't pass, I told my friend Mr. SYNG, one of our members, "If we fail, let's suggest buying a fire engine with the money. The Quakers can't object to that. Then, if you nominate me and I nominate you for a committee to do it, we'll buy a big cannon, which is certainly a fire engine." He said, "I see you've gotten clever from being in the Assembly so long. Your tricky plan would be a perfect match for their wheat or other grain trick."
The difficulties the Quakers faced because they had established and publicly declared that no war was lawful, a principle they couldn't easily abandon later, even if they changed their minds, reminds me of what I consider a smarter approach by another group among us, the Dunkers. I knew one of its founders, Michael Welfare, shortly after their group emerged. He complained to me that fanatics from other religions were unfairly slandering them, accusing them of terrible beliefs and practices they knew nothing about. I told him this always happens with new religious groups. I thought that to stop such slander, it might be a good idea to publish their articles of faith and their rules of conduct. He said they had considered it, but didn't agree, for this reason. When we first came together as a community, he said, God saw fit to enlighten our minds enough to realize that some beliefs we once thought were true were actually wrong, and others we thought were wrong were actually true. From time to time, he has given us more understanding, and our principles have been getting better, and our mistakes fewer. Now we're not sure we've reached the end of this journey or achieved perfect spiritual or religious knowledge. We're afraid that if we were to print our statement of beliefs, we'd feel tied down and restricted by it, and perhaps be unwilling to learn more. Our future generations would feel this even more, thinking that what we, their elders and founders, had done was sacred and could never be changed. This humility in a religious group is perhaps unique in human history. Every other group believes it has all the truth, and that anyone who disagrees is completely wrong. It's like a person traveling in fog. They see people ahead and behind them on the road, and in the fields on either side, all shrouded in mist. But near them, everything seems clear, even though they're just as much in the fog as everyone else. To avoid this kind of awkward situation, in recent years, the Quakers have gradually stepped back from public service in the assembly and as magistrates. They'd rather give up their power than their principles.
Chronologically, I should have mentioned earlier that in 1742 I invented an open stove that warmed rooms better and saved fuel because the fresh air coming in was heated as it entered. I gave a model of it to Mr. Robert Grace, an old friend of mine. Since he owned an iron furnace, he found making the metal plates for these stoves profitable, as they became very popular. To boost that demand, I wrote and published a pamphlet called An Account of the New Pennsylvania Fireplaces, etc. This pamphlet worked well. Governor Thomas was so impressed with the stove's design, as described in the pamphlet, that he offered me a patent to be the only one selling them for a number of years. But I turned it down because of a principle I've always held in such situations, which is, however, an iron dealer in London took a lot of my pamphlet's content, incorporated it into his own, and made some minor changes to the device, which actually made it work worse. He got a patent for it there, and, I was told, made a small fortune from it. And this isn't the only time others have patented my inventions, though not always with the same success. I never challenged these patents because I didn't want to profit from them myself, and I hate arguments. These fireplaces have saved, and continue to save, a lot of wood for people in many homes, both here and in nearby colonies.